The ultimate Intarsia tutorial. Hi everyone, Norman here. Today I want to teach you the ins and outs of Intarsia knitting. This is a fun technique where you can turn basically any picture into knitting and add color to your projects without changing the drape. We'll start with the basics and then towards the end of the video I'll show you some advanced tips and tricks. Let's dive right into it. At its core, Intarsia knitting is super simple, at least if it's a flat project. So as you can see, you knit with multiple strands of yarn per row and not just two or so. And then when you come to a color change, you drop the old color, then you pick up the new color in a way that you trap the old color. See here in between working yarn and work, like so. And then you continue knitting with the new color. So let's do that one more time. So you drop the old color, then you go here to the wrong side, find the new color, trap it here, see, trap it, and continue knitting. Maybe you need to tighten up lightly, but that is about it. And it's the exact same thing here on the wrong side. When you come to a color change, you drop the old color, pick up the new color in a way that you trap the old color here between work and working yarn, tighten up lightly, and continue working across until you come to the next color change, and then you repeat, drop the old color, pick up the new color, knit one stitch, tighten up lightly, and repeat. So far, so good. Those are the basics. This is the core of the Intarsia knitting technique. But if you want to tackle more advanced projects like this sweater, for example, we need to dive in a little bit deeper. So before I can show you all these advanced Intarsia techniques and tips and tricks and so on, we need to talk about all these things you need to do before you even knit a single stitch. A good Intarsia project is probably 50% preparation and only the rest is your knitting technique. So listen closely. First of all, we need to talk about charts. 99% of all Intarsia patterns I am aware of feature a chart. However, please don't be scared. Those charts are more like pictures and are super easy to read. Here is how. So, it's very important to realize that knitting charts are nothing else but a very abbreviated form of written instructions where each box stands for one stitch. So, I could write a knit 1 here in each box. Because this is very tedious, no one does this, but this is basically what a knitting chart is. And you read it from right to left because this is your knitting direction. So if you want to know how to work the third row, then you literally put your fingers on the 3 and then on the first box it is white. This means knit it in white. Then the second box is white as well, you knit it in white as well, and then the third box is white again, so you knit the third stitch in white as well. And then here the fourth stitch is in gray. This means you need to switch colors to whatever your legend tells you to knit this box in. The only slightly tricky bit is that all the wrong side rows, so meaning 2, 4, 6, 8 and so on, you read them in this direction because you need to turn your work around, and the chart always depicts the design from the right side so you can spot mistakes easily. But it's the same process. You put your fingers on the box and check, okay, which color is it? I knit it in white, white, white. Fourth stitch is in gray. That's literally it. Just a very abbreviated form of written instructions. No maths, no real charts. The important bit here is you need to go through this chart line by line, before you start knitting a single stitch so you can prepare your bobbins. Why? Well, there is one hard rule in Intarsia knitting. Whenever you change colors, you need to join in a new bobbin. This is the only hard rule. So here at the beginning, I only need 5. So there are 5 color changes. I start with one color here, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I want to knit this row, I need 5 bobbins or 5 skeins. However, as I move up in the chart, I will notice I need actually a little bit more. So here, round 11, this is where I suddenly need 7 bobbins because there are 6 color changes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if I want to knit this letter N, I actually need 7 bobbins. Of course, the chart you are working with might be a lot more complicated and have a lot more colors. So please take your time and diligently go through your chart. I mean, if you have some spare skeins, you can totally do this on the fly. But if you are only working with one skein, then you really need to prepare. At the most, I mean, you could knit from either end of a yarn cake, but that's the limit. Otherwise, you need to prepare bobbins. So, with that out of the way, let's knit some stitches together. As you can see, I cast on quite a couple of stitches here with a standard long tail cast on and simply knitted across a couple of rows in plain stockinette stitch. And this here marks my first color work row. And my chart tells me that the 9th stitch should be in the orange yarn. So I will stop one stitch ahead and I will join in the new color one stitch ahead like so. So here, as you can see, those are 8 stitches here. And now I will place the tail of the new color in between work and working yarn, and I leave a sizable tail for weaving in ends later on. And then I knit this stitch here as normal, trapping the new color on the back side, and then I switch colors. But before I switch colors, I twist these yarns around twice. See this? And then I pick up the new color any way you like and knit that next stitch in the new color. This is how I join in a new color when I do Intarsia knitting. Let's do that one more time. So my chart tells me I need to change colors after 3 stitches here in yellow. This means one stitch before that. One more time. I trap the new color here in between working yarn and work, knit one stitch, and then I twist these yarns around twice like so, tighten up slightly, and then I continue knitting. That is how I join in a new color for Intarsia. Of course, you can also do the same thing on the wrong side. So one stitch before the color change, you trap the new color in between work and working yarn, you knit one stitch, and then you twist these yarns around twice, tighten up before you continue knitting. And then one more time. So one stitch here before the color change, you trap the new color in between work and working yarn, leaving a sizable tail, and then you twist these yarns around twice and continue knitting like so. That's all you need to do. In the next row, things couldn't be easier. So here, when you come to the color change, you simply pick up the new color. Make sure that you don't accidentally pick up the tail. pick up the new color in a way that you trap the new color, the old color here, see, in between work and working yarn, and then simply knit 1 stitch. Tighten up lightly, so give this old tail here a gentle tuck, and then continue knitting. And when you come to the next color change, you do the exact same thing. Pick up the next color. Again, make sure that you don't accidentally pick up the tail. Trap the old color, or now old color, here in between work and working yarn. Knit 1 stitch, give this a gentle tug, and continue working across. The return row works more or less the same. So you work across until you come to the color change. Then you drop this color, pick up the new color, knit 1 stitch, give this a gentle tuck here, and then purl across until you come to the next color change. Then you pick up the new color, always making sure that you trap the old color here in between work and working yarn. Give this a gentle tug, really lightly here on the working yarn, and continue working across. That is all you need to do. Now here comes the probably most important trick when it comes to Intarsia knitting. So you probably will notice that here these tails are tangling up. So here is what you need to do to avoid this. Step number 1, untangle all the yarns, no matter if you are knitting from the skein or using bobbins. Please untangle all the skeins. In the first step, you knit across the first row as normal. So whenever you come to a color change, you pick up the yarn the way I showed you and knit across. Then here at the end of the row, you probably will notice that all these yarns are tangled. Now don't untangle them here, don't. Instead, turn the work around clockwise. So this here is clockwise. Turn your work around clockwise and then just knit across. Again, there is no need for any special technique. Just stick to what I've shown you. So always pick up the yarn in the exact same way and work across. And then when you come to the end of the row, here is where you need to pay attention. Now previously we turned around clockwise, now you turn around counterclockwise. And if you take a look at your skeins, now they should be untwisted again. So by turning around clockwise at the end of a right side row and counterclockwise at the end of a wrong side row, or vice versa, actually it doesn't matter, you are always ending up with untwisted yarns here at the beginning of your row, as long as you don't join in new colors. Now, admittedly, most Intarsia projects aren't just vertical straight lines. So how do you knit diagonals? Well, it couldn't be easier. You simply stop 1 stitch. Well, in this case, if the diagonal is towards the right, you stop 1 stitch before the old color change, pick up the new color, making sure that you trap the old color, knit 1 stitch, tighten up lightly, and work across. And it works exactly the same here. in the other direction. So instead of changing colors now, I knit one more stitch. Be careful, that stitch will typically be a little bit on the looser side, and then pick up the new color here in the exact same way, tighten up and continue knitting. So very, very simple. And you've probably already guessed it. It's the exact same thing here on the wrong side. So one stitch before the old color change, I stop, pick up the new color in the exact same way, tighten up and work across. And if your color block needs to be wider towards the left, it's again the very same thing. You simply knit one more stitch in this old color, and that's all you need to do. Now, let's say I want to bridge here more than one stitch, but 3. Well, theoretically speaking, I just could, just continue knitting. Let's do 3 stitches here. And then I could pick up this color. However, if I were to do that, see, then I would create a very, very long float here on the backside. First of all, jewelry, fingers, whatever can get caught, but also depending on your tension, if you mess up your tension even slightly, your fabric will pucker. That's probably not what you want to do. So instead, I propose to do it like so. So here is how I do it instead, setting aside that my stitches are getting worn out a little bit. So here, when I come to the old color change, I will pick up the new color, cross it with the old color, but I will continue knitting here with the old color. So I trap the new color here on the backside. Then you can decide to do this with every stitch. Typically, you get away with doing it every second stitch. So here for the second stitch, you cross these yarns one more time, knit the third stitch here, and then let's suppose here I want to change colors in earnest. Well, then you need to trap these yarns one more time. However, to do that, you need to twist them around twice, like so, twice, like so, and then you can tighten up, stretch these stitches out, and continue working across, and you will be able to see that we created these little, we trapped these floats here on the back side. It is secure, and I feel this is much better, especially if you want to bridge, say 3, 4, 5, or 6 stitches. Now the big issue is when you want to do this in the other direction. Say here I want to mirror this and I want to switch colors here for this stitch. Then you need to plan ahead. So I am here on the purl side, on the wrong side, one row before the actual color change. So I will change colors as normal. But then, as I knit the next stitch here, I will cross these yarns one more time. Again, trapping this color in between work and working yarn. And then for the third stitch, I'll do the same. Again, you can do this every second stitch or every stitch, depending on your preferences. And now, this yarn is already in the right spot. The spot it needs to be in the next row. And then here in the next row, as I've just said, the yarn here is already in the right spot. There it is. So you just pick it up. Of course, you also trap the old color here in between work and working yarn, tighten up. That bit is the same. The only bit that changes is that you need to plan ahead. Now we covered one stitch, multiple stitches, but what if the diagonal is just 2 stitches? Well, there are 2 ways to do this, and I want to compare them here with you together. So the easiest way to change colors would be, okay, so here I want to switch colors, 2 stitches in, then I simply continue knitting like so, and then when I need to switch colors here, just like before, I trap the old yarn here in between work and working yarn and continue knitting as so. And the second version is only a tiny little bit more complicated. So you knit that last stitch, and then here before I knit the next stitch, I bring up what's going to be the new yarn, cross it, knit 1 stitch, well, tighten up lightly, and then here for the next stitch I cross things 1 more time, and then I drop this color, bring up the new color, and continue knitting across. So I'm going to decrease, well, this random shape here actually, in this same manner for a couple of more rows, so without any technique here on this side, and by trapping the new color over on this side, and then we are going to compare the result. So a couple of rows later, this here will be the result. So I did the same kind of color changes here on both sides. Here I didn't use a special technique. Here I trapped these stitches or the yarn twice. And at first sight, I'm inclined to say that this side here looks better than this side, especially if I stretch things out. Here you get a rather clean step. Here, I don't know how well you can see this. Here you get this kind of knot-like structure. And it's very similar if you take a look at the wrong side. So here you get this diagonal. It might be a little bit offset and it might not trace the actual shape, but here, well, it actually traces the shape here of whatever you're trying to paint, but it probably doesn't look prettier. However, here, this is just a standard vertical color change. And if I pull this apart, can you see these structures? And they actually look exactly how these structures here look. So, if I pull this apart, you get a different kind of border stitch on this side and yet a different border stitch on this side. Whereas over on this side, let me see if I can stretch this out without dropping stitches. Here on this side, the border stitches here will look exactly the same on both sides. So this is to say that not all Intarsia projects will be the same, and you kind of need to be careful on how you change colors. As a general rule of thumb, I would say the more you stick to the same old mantra, knit across without any special technique, and when you change colors, then you trap the old color between work and working yarn. This will be the easiest way to knit Intarsia, and it will lead to the most consistent and neatest results. However, in certain cases, adding complexities might lead to more consistent results. Now there's one last little bit here I need to talk about when it comes to the technique. So sometimes you need to phase out a color. So let's suppose this yellow shape here was done and I only need to continue with the blue yarn. Well, what would I do? Of course, I would just continue knitting with the blue yarn. However, I actually urge you to cross these colors one last time. Just cross them one last time, tighten up, and then continue. So one more time. So let's suppose here, this of course means I don't need this blue yarn here either. So I will cross these colors. Tighten up, but only continue with the yarn from the original, from the start of the row. But of course, you don't necessarily have to break the yarn. So sometimes you have a repeat where, you just have to repeat these structures all over again. And let's suppose you actually need this yellow-orange yarn here in the exact same spot, just, 2, 3, or 4 rows above. Well, in this case, I, of course, would also just knit across in the blue yarn. However, I would cross these yarns just the same, but keep the bobbin or my skein attached and continue like so. And then of course in the next row, when you come to that spot, you do the exact same thing. Again, you trap that color. I leave it up to you how often you do that. You actually don't have to do this in every row. Every 2 or 3 rows is typically plenty. I'm just trying to show you how you would do it here on the wrong side. Typically, I wouldn't do this in every row, but maybe in every 3rd row is typically enough. And then typically I will cross it one more time right in the row, right before the row I will need it. Sadly, Intarsia knitting typically means a lot of loose tails here at the back of your work. You need to weave them in. And there are 2 ways to do this. First of all, you can weave in all tails as you go. However, since you are weaving in tails in a different color, this can be very visible, so typically I don't. So typically I use a sharp tapestry needle and weave my tails in like that. So here, this is a blue tail, so I will weave it in here in a blue panel, and then I use a sharp tapestry needle here and go through these purl bumps here on the back side. And then I pull the tapestry needle all the way through. Massage things out so you don't constrict the fabric. And then when you need to weave in a tail in a different color, say this tail here, then of course you try to weave it in here in this panel as best as possible. Sometimes, so if it's just a small panel like this one here, you can only go so many stitches in that direction. Well, then you go in a different direction. And personally speaking, I feel this is the neatest and most invisible way to weave in tails for Intarsia knitting, because here on the right side it won't be visible. It doesn't here, this is where we wove in. It isn't visible. It doesn't constrict the fabric in the least. That's how I do it. With these few techniques, you can basically finish every Intarsia project. However, I want to add a couple of tips and tricks for better results. First of all, we need to talk about gauge. So before you start with your project, you need to work on a little swatch. incorporate, it doesn't really have to be big, but incorporate all the kind of color transitions you will have in your project. Wash and block your swatch and then check if your gauge is fine enough that nothing peeks through when you stretch it lightly. If your fabric is too loosey-goosey, all these transitions, they will not look very nice, and then you might have to go down a needle size, sometimes even 2. Generally speaking, I would knit Intarsia with a relatively small knitting needle. So if the yarn, on the label it sometimes says recommended for size 4 to 6 or so, then I will typically go for 4, maybe even 3.5 or 3 millimeters, something like that. So in my experience, a solid and densely spun yarn that blooms a little bit but not too much works best. If the yarn is too fussy, all the details will get lost. I mean, sometimes that looks nice, but typically it doesn't. And if your yarn is too airily spun, so a lot of rustic sheep wool yarns are spun like that, then the chances are very, very high that you can see parts, especially the parts you actually want to hide on the wrong side, can peek through. And I would also pay attention to, so if you use a lot of colors, often like the white yarn, the pastel colors, it really depends a little bit on the dye, will look a lot thinner. So if I use white or natural tones, sometimes I will knit these with 2 yarns held together, and only your swatch can tell you. But sometimes if you have black and white yarn together, it will appear almost as if the one was fingering and the other was decay. So then again, your swatch can tell you. Second tip: avoid Intarsia panels that are too small. So I often get the question how to get the border stitches of a color panel to look a little bit neater. And the truth is, those are essentially selvage stitches. In many ways, they behave the same because unlike any other stitch in your fabric, you have 2 stitches sitting on top of each other that are directly connected. And you will always have this little gap here where you twisted the yarn, and this will always look a little bit differently. And you will always have, if you stretch things out a little bit, you will always have that little twisted connection that will look a little bit differently. So as a result, I would, generally speaking, avoid any color panel that is less than 3 stitches wide as much as possible. So think of it like that. So long vertical lines that are just 1 stitch wide are essentially just edge stitches. So on either side it is an edge stitch. So as soon as you even lightly stretch the fabric, that will show. So it doesn't matter how high the color panels are, because those are no edge stitches, just on the side. So if you take a look at this design here, you will notice that these lines here, I mean, they might just be 1 or 2 rows high, but they are always, or almost always, 2, 3, or 4 stitches wide, because I don't want this design to be just edge stitches, because this will always show. It's also very, very important that you knit very carefully whenever you come to a color change. There are 2 things you absolutely need to be aware of. Theoretically speaking, these 2 stitches here are directly connected. So I finished the row, twisted these 2 colors, and then in the next row I twisted the colors again, and then I knitted this stitch. So all that is in between these 2 stitches are 2 twists. But because there are 2 twists, if I pull here on this yarn here, I won't close this stitch here. See, all I possibly can do is here, I steal yarn from these adjacent stitches, but no matter how hard I pull here on this stitch, I won't close this stitch simply because there is just too much twist in between. This is exactly why I said to pull lightly on the working yarn. So here, when I come to the color change, I told you to pick up the yarn, and then once you finished this, I told you to pull lightly on the working yarn to close that stitch again, because after you've added 2 twists here, it will be very, very difficult to tighten that stitch up. Secondly, as you knit across, you always work into the row below, into a previous row. So for most continental knitters, this means they stretch out this stitch here 1 row below, because you are forcing 2 knitting needles into a stitch where previously only 1 was. So here I stretch this stitch here out as I knit this stitch, but then here as I knit the next stitch, this action by forcing 2 knitting needles into that stitch will steal back that slack. So, you know, the slack has to come from somewhere. So with every stitch you knit, that slack gets carried over to the next stitch. The problem is here. Your last stitch of a color panel, again, you force 2 knitting needles into that stitch gets larger. But now watch closely. I drop this yarn, pick up the new color, knit 1 stitch. And then 2 things need to be observed. No matter how hard I pull on the working yarn for this stitch, nothing whatsoever will happen to this stitch. But also, if I pull here on the old color, nothing will happen to this stitch, because this stitch here isn't connected to the working yarn. So all that slack stays here, right, locked into this stitch, permanently locked. So when it comes to Intarsia knitting, it's very important that you try to knit as closely to the tip as possible, because then you avoid stretching out that last stitch overly much. I mean, it will always happen a little bit, that's okay, but you don't want to stretch out that last stitch overly much. So you kind of need to try to knit very close to the tip, so you don't carry over all that much slack here into this stitch and enlarging it, because once this is big, this is basically locked. I mean, you can manually fix things later on, but I'm not sure if you want to go through each and every stitch of your, I don't know, sweater, Intarsia sweater like so. That's probably not what you want. So try to knit close to the tip, and also watch your knitting needles. There are some knitting needles that have a longer taper and some that have a shorter taper, and the longer the taper is, the more, well, real estate you have to work. So for Intarsia knitting, probably knitting needles with a longer taper typically lead to neither results. Tip number 4. Don't mix techniques. So there are multiple ways to knit colorwork. Intarsia certainly isn't the only one. There's mosaic knitting, double knitting, fair island, stranded knitting, and some even use duplicate stitch and other forms of embroidery to introduce color. All of these techniques are valid. However, they all create a different fabric with a different drape. And the important bit here is that Intarsia is the only technique that doesn't introduce a second layer or a fabric that is twice as thick. So why does this matter? Well, sometimes you have a chart where you will have, say, 2 stitches in blue, followed by 2 stitches in red, followed by another 2 stitches in blue. And then it might be tempting to carry the blue yarn over, just bridge those 2 stitches. What could happen? I mean, it's just a small little float. Well, here is the problem. Whenever you stretch out fabric, it will stretch out at the weakest link. And in this case, the intarsia will be the weakest link, because here the fabric isn't reinforced in any kind. So if you have even a tiny little bit of fair knitting, stranded knitting, mosaic knitting, whatever you have in the middle of your fabric, even embroidery could be like that, then if you stretch things out, the whole fabric will stretch except that little bit, or maybe that little bit won't stretch out as much, and then you will get puckering wrinkles or just kind of a weird drape, and this will be noticeable. So as a general rule of thumb, no matter how tempting it may be, stick to the rule: new color panel means new bobbin. When you knit intarsia, you typically constantly fight with your bobbins, with your skeins. So that's why I told you, stick to the rule. At the end of a right side row, turn around clockwise, and then at the end of a wrong side row, turn back counterclockwise. And if you stick to that, your yarns won't end up in a tangled mess. However, as soon as you need to join in a new color, as soon as we did here below, as soon as you carry a color over a couple of stitches, this rule won't work anymore. So here are two little tips. First of all, use actual bobbins. So if you go to your local yarn shop, you might find little bobbins that look similar like this. I mean, here I also have this ancient little bobbin here that is, this is ivory, but you can basically create your own little bobbins using cardboard. That's what it is. That is what a bobbin is. The important bit is, if you wind your yarn on bobbins, you can simply let it dangle down, and then when you come to the color, you unlock the yarn. So here there's a little slit here, same over here. You unlock the yarn, you unwind whatever you need, and then you knit from the bobbin. And then here, when you come to the next color change, you find the next color, unlock it, unwind it, keep it here in the back, tighten up. And the important bit is, now this is where it gets slightly annoying. Of course, you need to wind this bobbin here again and lock it. But that way, if you keep this yarn here short and short enough, there is no room for your yarns to get tangled. So this makes it very easy to manage those yarns, but of course you constantly need to lock and unlock these bobbins here. This can be, as I said, a little bit annoying, but you know, you kind of need to decide what's more annoying, your yarn getting tangled up, or, you know, constantly going through these extra motions. If you only work with a set number of colors, an egg carton like this one here can also be a smart solution. So you put in your balls of yarn here in the slots where usually the eggs would go, then you close it, and then you can dispense the yarn like so, and the individual, as long as you don't cross it, things don't get tangled. Of course, this invites the next big problem. There are tons of complex intarsia patterns with many tiny little flecks of color. So for example, here for this sweater, there are rows. It doesn't look all that complex, but there are rows where you have 25 or 30 color changes. And so you need to split up that single skein in many tiny little pieces, and of course you don't want to waste all that much yarn. So how do you figure out how much yarn you should wind on your little bobbin? Well, here's how to figure that out. So you are hopefully going to knit a swatch anyway, and as you knit that swatch, somewhere here in the middle of your swatch, take a little stitch marker here like this one here, then pierce it right through the yarn here between two stitches. just pierce it and secure it. And then you knit 10 stitches or 20. The more the better. So I'm just going to knit 10 here. So that's 5. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then you take another stitch marker and pierce it. Well, you can't see this. Another stitch marker and pierce it right through the yarn. Secure the marker. And then you think back. Then you think those 10 stitches back, and then things are fairly simple. So you simply measure the distance between these two stitch markers. In my case, that's 21 centimeters. And then you only need a little bit of math. So if 10 stitches, that's what we've measured, 10 stitches are 21 centimeters. Of course, you can also measure in inches if you prefer that. So simply divide these two numbers. That's round about, your calculator will do this, 0.47 centimeter per stitch. That's how much yarn I need per stitch. And then you need to go through your chart and count how many stitches your color panel has. Say the color panel has 50 stitches, just one example. Then you take these 50 stitches and multiply this with this number. So 50 stitches multiplied with 0.47 centimeters per stitch, the result would be 23.8 centimeters. That's how much yarn you need. Now your gauge will always be a little bit off when you measure it on a swatch. So I would, just add a little buffer. So take those 23.8 centimeters and add round about 10 to 15%. So that would be, roughly 26 centimeters. That's how much yarn you comfortably will need without fearing, without playing yarn chicken. However, you also need two little tails because obviously you probably want to weave in those tails on either end of the color panel. So this will depend a little bit on personal preference. For me, 15 centimeters is plenty, so 7 centimeters per tail. But if you want more, then work with 20 or 25. So the end result would be 41 centimeters. That's how much yarn I would have to wind up on a bobbin if I want to knit 50 stitches with it. And then you basically need to go through your whole chart and do the exact same math. But if you use Excel or some other program, you can just switch the inputs and it goes really quickly. And then you of course also need to measure the yarn, but that's how you would have to do it if you really want to save yarn. Now please don't overthink it. If you only need each color once per row or something like that, there is no need to split your skein. However, if you want to knit some checkerboard or famous argyle patterns, stuff like that, then this is where you would have to do these kind of calculations so you don't end up with a lot of scrap yarn. But otherwise, just knit from your skein or from either end of a yarn cake, things like that, or split your skein and do two little yarn cakes. This is typically a little bit better to avoid too much scrap yarn. Now, here at the end, I want to add some last words. First of all, I really have to highlight that this video was made possible by the support from my loyal patrons. YouTube doesn't even pay me remotely enough to cover my bills. So if you enjoyed this video, this kind of video, then consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll add the link to the description below. Think of it as an honesty box. Secondly, this video covered flat Intarsia. Please comment below if you would also like to see a similar in-depth tutorial on Intarsia in the round. If there is enough interest, and by enough interest I mean more than just one or two random comments without any upvotes, I could also record one as well. The mechanics of knitting Intarsia in the round are completely different, and by completely different I mean completely different. It's almost as if you compare double knitting to brioche knitting. So please comment below if you are interested. Thirdly, feel free to comment if you have any further questions. I tried to cover a lot of the standard use cases and beyond that, but Intarsia knitting is such a wild field, and I'm sure there are certain situations that require special attention, so don't shy away from commenting below. And lastly, please like this video if you enjoyed watching, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, happy knitting, happy Intarsia knitting, and enjoy the rest of your day.